My name is Peter Zellner. I coordinate a few programs here. One of them is Cultural Studies, formerly known as History Theory. And it's my pleasure to introduce a writer and a thinker and an architect tonight, somebody I think who the school can pay some attention to, vis-a-vis the relationship between architecture, writing, and publishing. His name is Michael Kubo. Michael is a writer and editor. He's currently pursuing his Ph.D. in History Theory and Criticism of Architecture at MIT. He was a graduate of Harvard's Ph.D. In the SCI-Arc program, and his research focuses now on the history of publishing as a strategic form of architectural practice, Cold War architecture of the Rand Corporation. He's the co-author of several books, including The Function of Ornament with Farshid Musavi. Other editorial projects include Cartesian Analysis, The Infrastructural City, Network Ecologies in Los Angeles, and Sanford Winter's Far from Equilibrium. And I found tonight that he also worked with my teacher, Reyner Banham, as an editor in the Rotterdam office in the first half of this decade, so that was very fascinating to discover. Michael traces the influence of architectural publishing as an operative device through an examination of books produced by architects and critics in the past century. In this history, publishing reveals itself as an alternative form of practice, parallel and frequently more agile than other forms of production, more typically understood as architectural. So that's the overview. Michael recently collaborated in the design and curating of an exhibition at the Pink Comic Gallery in Boston, a show called Publishing Practices, which was set up in conjunction with gallery directors and fellow architects Mark Pasnick and Chris Grimley, excuse me. And this is a very interesting exhibition. I hope you'll see some of it tonight. But it provides a kind of look into this relationship between reading, writing, and design. And if I may just read excerpt from an interview that recently appeared on Art Daily. Michael says, through case studies, it became very clear that some architects have operated just as much as publishers, as architects, I'm paraphrasing, and have understood very well the difference between publishing a book and making a project, e.g. a building. And they've never wanted those two to reinforce each other in a one-to-one matchup. The corpus is one of them, and Rem Koolhaas is another. They both use their books as a way to sort of excavate a space in which they can stake out certain kinds of architectural projects. And in their publishing, they use their architectural projects to make certain theoretical arguments, but were never completely aligned. So I think that's a very interesting observation. I wanted to share with you an interesting photograph I found of two such architects. This is Peter Eisenman and Rem Koolhaas. I don't know if you can see this one. This photograph was taken in Brett Steele's office at the Architectural Association. And if you look carefully, I know it's a sort of a blurry photograph, you'll see on the shelf behind them, of course, MVRDB's Farmax, but you'll find other books like Flux by Asymptote here. This is Lady of Utopias up here. This is Manuel Yolanda's 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, et cetera, et cetera. I think that quite often architects pay a sort of short trip to the fact that we tend to make more things that are printed and published sometimes that are built and experienced. I think that probably on the balance, if you looked at the most significant architects in recent history, writing has not just been a preoccupation or a kind of hobby, it's been a form of practice. So in the case of both Mr. Eisenman and Mr. Koolhaas, I mean, these are two very interesting books that work retrospectively at problems related to their practices. In the first case, we have Eisenman's Giuseppe Tirani Transformations, Decompositions, and Critiques of 2003, which is his magnum opus. It's 40 years of work, essentially, documenting and investigating the work of Italian rationalist architect Giuseppe Tirani. In particular, it looks at two projects, the Casa del Fascio and the Casa Giuliani Frigiero, both in Como. And in this book, what's interesting to me is that Eisenman employs essentially a kind of what he calls critically textual readings of architecture, as a way of kind of rewriting a certain history, and in particular his own. I mean, the book is actually autobiographical, strangely enough. The other book you all would know, 1978, Delirious New York, a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan, in which Koolhaas both analyzes and celebrates New York City at the same time. He suggests the city as a site, as he says, for infinite variety of human activities, and famously discusses both the real and imagined, the metropolitan lifestyle and the cultural congestion, which he states Manhattan is the 20th century's Rosetta Stone, occupied by architectural mutations, Central Park, the skyscraper, utopian fragments, Rockefeller Center, the UN Building, international phenomenon, radio, City Music Hall. So I think, perhaps Michael will sort of shed some light on this phenomenon. For me, what's so interesting is that these are two projects which work in both directions. Famously, Koolhaas writes about the past as a way of kind of projectively predicting a career and using research. Jeff Kippens talks about this all the time, that it takes 15 to 18 years for them to actually realize in the very big libraries of Paris some of the ideas that are captured in the book. And similarly, Eisenman writes about the past as a way of kind of reconciling a career with his research. So I think that, hopefully tonight we'll find out more about this relationship. I think it's a very important one. I don't know that in LA we pay enough attention to books, let alone media. But hopefully tonight we'll find out more about why it's important for us to write, I think. So look forward to the talk. Thank you for coming.
Is this thing on? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for the very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Josh Bernardo in particular for sending the invitation. It's very nice for me to take what had been research that was originally developed for a seminar and then produce an exhibition and turn it into a lecture kind of for the first time. As a particular, you'll see that a lecture is a very sort of interesting and slightly odd format for this sort of work. So the subject of this talk is in large part the product of a personal reflection over the last year and a half on the course of my professional life up to this point. So I'm trained as an architect, and I've always considered my work to be embedded within the architectural field. I've always considered myself to be an architect in the way that I practice, or certainly in the way that I think about my practice. But in the last decade of my professional life, I've operated almost entirely through the production of architectural books. First as an editor, later as a publisher, and these days as a writer, and by title at least these days as a historian, or somebody who will become a historian relatively soon. And so stepping back after 10 years or so of that work, I felt the need to reflect on the path that I've taken, and in some sense to try to place myself within the field, or to map out a certain lineage within which I could situate myself as an architect who's operated through publishing and editorial practices. And so I wanted to look at the history of publishing practices by architects during the last century or so, and to see how common this kind of practice actually was, and whether I could detect any sort of commonalities or threads that would allow me in a way to look differently at the history of the last century or so, architecture through publications rather than through buildings. And so one of the questions was whether I was really alone in this endeavor, or whether there was a certain community that I could say that I could put myself within. And so this led to what Peter already mentioned, the Publishing Practices Project. And so the project traces the history and influence of architectural publishing as an operative device through an examination of books produced by architects and critics over the past century. And so the research has been conducted over the last year and a half, roughly. It was first developed through seminar teaching as the Banham Fellow at SUNY Buffalo last year, and then developed afterwards into the form that you see here, an exhibition in Pink Comma Gallery in Boston. So I have to publicly thank Chris Grimley of Over Under for the graphic form of the content that you see here, which developed after Buffalo, and has been fairly crucial to the work since then, and to curating and co-curating with me and exhibiting work at Pink Comma Gallery, which he also runs. And so, as you might expect, or maybe you wouldn't expect, over the last century, the practice of architecture has in fact been closely related to the practice of publishing by architects. And so just as buildings and architectural drawings produce discourse and exist themselves within discourse, so the discourse of the book is often been used by architects to frame a related space in which their projects can be produced, received, and understood. And so many of the most prominent architects of the past century have also been its most prolific publishers, whether as editors of magazines and journals. And so here just highlighted are a few: Sitsky, Mies, Korb, Nike, Bob Stern, Eisenman, Wren, Moneo, Stephen Hall have done magazines, journals, pamphlets, or as authors of book formats, including monographs, manifestos, histories, transcripts, catalogs, etc. Some more: Gropius, Smithsons, Venturi and Scott-Brown, Schumann. Or as historians, more properly, or as the instigators of publishing houses or other channels of dissemination. So Korb famously also essentially ran a publishing house through his office. Eisenman is something similar. Bob Stern operated as a historian, and so on. And some of these architects have regarded the design process itself as a form of editing or iteration. I think of Kohlhaas as being one of these in particular. And in certain cases assisted by prior backgrounds in journalism, script writing, filmmaking, or other editorial practices that have informed their later work within the architectural field. Their disciplinary agendas have also been influenced by operative critics. You'll see a few of them in the work tonight, trained as historians or in related fields, who have sought to produce forms of scholarship that were intended to have very direct impact on architectural practice itself. And so it was scholarship that was intended to speak to the architects. And so architects and critics alike have seen books as strategic tools in the arsenal of the discipline, capable of producing effects independent of the constraints of traditional forms of architectural production, by which I mean buildings, among other things. The specific combination of publishing and building has been exploited as a critical double form of architectural practice, as strands of work that are assumed to support each other, but which in reality often reveal a provocative and in many cases quite deliberate misalignment. So rather than simply seeing books as guides or manuals for practice, the most prominent architects and critics have understood well the strategic differences between publishing and building, as Peter's mentioned, exploiting both as parallel but distinct discursive modes of operation. In this history, publishing reveals itself as an alternative form of practice, parallel to and frequently more agile than other forms of production, more typically understood as architectural. And so the Publishing Practices Project is a series of, it's based on 10 case studies. Each one looks at the origins, composition, and after products of an influential architecture book from the last century or so. We might call these canonical books, although I'll have more to say about that term later, right? And so you can see here, the 10 are Tourism and Architecture, 1923, the complete works of the Corbusier, which started in 1929 and was published 8 volumes after that. Space, Time, and Architecture, Gideon from 1937, the Modular, also Korb from 49. The Heroic Period of Modern Architecture by Allison and Smithsons, 1965. Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Robert Venturi, 1966. Los Angeles, the Architecture of Four Ecologies, which I'm sure most of you, I'm assuming it's required reading at SCI-Arc. If that's not true, then maybe we have something to talk about. By Reyner Banham in 1971, and then shortly thereafter, Learning from Las Vegas by Venturi and Scott-Brown in 1972, Delirious New York, which Peter's already mentioned, in 1978, Houses of Cards, another seminal Eisenman book from 1987, and then finally, the terminus of the study, perhaps a logical one, is SML by Kohlhaas in 1995. And so each one of these books, for me, is representative of a particular era of architectural production, and a specific conception of the role and performance of the book on the part of its producers. Beyond providing a particular narrative of the story of 20th century architecture through its publications, these case studies include reinventions and critiques of some of the, what I think of as the privileged genres of the architectural book, the manifesto, the monograph, and the history. And so the manifesto is typically seen as being closest to the traditional idea of a guide. It is by definition polemical, seeming to outline a theory to be projected onto practice, either to legitimize or to inform particular forms of architectural production. Its lineage begins with the prototypical example of the manifesto of 20th century architecture, the sort of newer example of Corbusier's Tourism and Architecture, and includes a series of very conscious inversions and revisions to the type throughout the last century. And so we have the gentle manifesto of Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. We have, to some extent, the sort of quasi-scientific manifesto of the Modular. And we have the retroactive manifesto of Delirious New York. A related genre also represented here could be called the city as manifesto. So this form emerged in the 1970s, halfway between the scholarly history and the traditional form of a theoretical treatise. And so it uses, it's a very specific lineage that uses the description of a specific urban condition, its identification and presentation to architects, an account of its performances, or the deliberate retelling of its history, in order to construct a certain sort of manifesto for rethinking architectural and urban practices in the present. And so its foundational examples for me are Reyner Banham's LA, the Architecture for Ecologies, learning from Las Vegas again, and Delirious New York as a very particular lineage that emerges entirely in the 1870s. And so Delirious New York belongs to various of these categories, and so you can see it's both one of the first members of what I think of as a new genre and an explicit reformatting of an existing Corbusian precedent of the manifesto. The form also reappears in SML-XL in various guises, particularly in Singapore Songlines, a 90-page mini book that's sort of stuffed in there. And then this genre of the city of manifesto, I think, is most significantly picked up by Kohlhaas in the project on the city and in manifestos on Pearl River Delta, Lagos. And so though the manifesto is deliberately polemical as part of its strategic mode of operation, it's not subordinate to or exclusively directed towards practice. Instead, the manifesto tries to create a context for other forms of architectural production to be received and understood. Just as buildings, often by the same authors, create a discursive context in which writing and publishing practices like the manifesto can be received in turn. So each has a kind of reciprocal influence on the other. Neither is merely a demonstration of or guide for the other in a simplistic relationship. Another privileged form of the 20th century architecture book is the monograph. The monograph attempts to consolidate a body of work into a set of agendas constituted through practice. In contrast to the manifesto, which constructs its agendas by consolidating a series of theoretical or polemical statements. And so the monograph as a form is again, maybe we shouldn't be surprised, initially dominated by the example of Le Corbusier in the exhaustive form of his complete works, published in 8 volumes from 1929 through 1865. The subsequent revisions to the genre, needless to say, have been innumerable. There's the inclusion of projects at the end of the manifesto, a particular sort of hybrid, to demonstrate that through theory, an architectural discovery has taken place. In Complexity of Contradiction, this happens. It's less well remembered that in the first edition of Learning from Las Vegas, this also happens. There are projects at the end. They were chopped out in the second edition. And then the method is also very deliberately reprised in the fictional and sort of delirious form of Delirious New York. There's also Eisenman's House of Cards, which conspicuously mixes the processes of writing, drawing, and building, along with building as drawing as writing as building, etc., into a version of the monograph as a conceptual construct or a form of architecture in and of itself. And then there's SML-XL, of course, where the promiscuous fusion of monograph and manifesto triggers a new type that is at once both a new genre of book and a massive new format. And the last genre of book included here is what I would call the polemical or operative history. Polemical history's attempt to reconstruct the past, to lay out the canon of architects and projects anew, to provide a context in which particular ways of working in the present can be received and justified. Examples range from the universalizing condition of Siegfried Gideon's space-time architecture, which purported to provide and was essentially taken as the official history of the modern movement in architecture, all the way to the intimate and sort of more humble approach of the Smithsons in the heroic period of modern architecture, which is compiled as a sort of personal scrapbook of sources that were of interest to them. It also encompasses the method of architecture for ecologies, where we see a historian and a critic undoing the methods of historical writing in order to get his head around an urban condition that doesn't quite correspond to the normal mode of the historian, or Delirious New York, which invents a sort of fictional narrative and has history as another mode of producing historical narratives. And so a brief aside is that one immediate question in looking at these books is the issue of the canon. The term comes up a lot, and you might think in looking at this that this is somehow a sort of fetishistic project about canonical works, or that it's based on an idea of canon. So what do we mean when we talk about canon? How do we define the term canonical? According to the conventional argument, which is typically made by those invested in the canon as something that needs to be defended, the identification of certain works as canonical is closely related to the very idea of architecture as a discipline. And so the fact of having and naming an identifiable canon, of being able to label works as canonical, is seen as central to the idea of architecture as a distinct discipline, well-defined unto itself, and not, for example, simply a subset of other practices. In other words, if architecture is held to be a discipline, so the argument goes, it must have a canon. In this formulation, the discipline doesn't simply constitute its own canon. We could say equally that the canon constitutes the discipline. And so the furthest consequence of this argument would be the idea that as an architect, it's not just that one is expected or assumed to be aware of these books. It's that if one does not know the canon, one is not really an architect. In this sense, canonical books, according to this traditional sort of argument, are supposed to be part and parcel of the constitution of the discipline itself. And while this may seem like an extreme or outmoded or even absurd sort of conservative sort of definition, or it might seem like an arbitrary designation that's assigned onto works after the fact, in fact, this idea of canonicity, I would argue, has conditioned the production of architecture books through the period that I deal with in this project. And so whatever other forms of media have been produced and circulated in and around architectural practice, whether they're more ephemeral or permanent, the agility and durability of the book, I think, has made it a privileged format for architects that are themselves attempting to construct a sort of canonicity, both for their books and for themselves. And so this question is actually not innocent at all. It reappears today when we see even the newest and supposedly most agile forms of media, such as blogs and websites, still aspiring to a certain sort of canonicity or aspiring to engage with what are seen as canonical modes of architectural discourse by adopting the privileged form of the book, right? And so every attempt that we know of, a blog or a website that then produces a book out of itself, I would argue is an attempt to construct or to relate itself to this sort of canonicity. So it's not a sort of dead question. In fact, I think it's quite live. Okay, and so in contrast to this conservative or traditional definition, rather than talking about a discipline with all the boundaries and exclusions that implies, what if we were to talk about architecture as a field, in the Bourdieu sense of the term, as a field of cultural production, and about publishing as merely one of its modes of practice, different from but no less important in its operation and the production of buildings. In this field, both publishing and building practices would be seen as equally necessary in creating the possibility for different sorts of discursive modes of operation in architecture. And so a canonical book, if we still allow ourselves to use the word, would then be one in which this discursive operation is most clearly revealed in the book's totality as a graphic object, as a careful and deliberate construction of format, layout, images, and words in relation to other discursive modes of practice. And so a list of canonical works defined in this way might then be simply those works that have been the most instrumental in their operation in that capacity. And so the 10 books in publishing practices weren't, I didn't really think of them as being chosen as canonical works, but as examples, strong examples of this kind of instrumental operation. And so one criterion was to imagine that if you took a slice through the field in a particular era, its major sites of discourse, production, education, and dissemination, we might expect to find that particular book consistently across those contexts as a form of common knowledge or shared currency within the field at a specific moment. And so the representation of these books conceived of in that way might look less like this and something more like this. So this would be a spectrum or a sort of DNA map of the sources, influences, and after effects that flow through a particular book, in this case, Learning from Las Vegas, and to a lesser extent, contradiction. And so in this process, I would argue that editors, curators, and publishers cannot be regarded as external to architectural practice. They are crucial actors in the production of architectural agendas, in the same way that engineers, contractors, and fabricators are crucial actors in the production of buildings. If the editorial process shares certain similarities to the processes of architectural production, it's also fundamentally different from the conventional idea of authorship. The editorial process, at least in the way that I've participated in it, is essentially a curatorial process that's based on the accumulation of a density of material within a given project. Not just different forms of content, but also different sources, references, ideas, relationships, agendas, that are then mediated and structured through very strategic choices in selection, structure, weight, rhythm, pacing, and language, both visual and textual. And in that sense, I regard editing less as a discipline separate from architecture and as a methodology that can be applied equally to the production of books and buildings. And I think some of the architects that have worked on this project also quite conspicuously see the architectural practice in that way. This method must be judged differently from the typical idea of the author/architect as the generator of original work. Instead, the practice of the author involves the mediation of a density of forces and intentions that can condense within the physical space of the project, whether that space manifests itself in published or in architectural production. And so the project is constructed as a timeline of these 10 case studies. It's a graphic timeline of their influences, the things that feed into them, and their afterlives from 1910 to 2010. And so the timeline includes a before at the top of the screen. Here, I'll flip through it in sort of more zoom detail. And so at the top, the timeline includes a before for each book, influences on each book's conception and design, prior publications by the same or different authors, early publications of the book's content in other formats, mock-ups, critical sources of images that we use there. And at the bottom of the timeline, it contains an after for subsequent publications by the same author, reformatting or republication of a book's content towards different ends, often as a result of the changing role of the book itself over time, and or recycling of the same material in later works. And so in the middle, you see a sort of during, which is the book itself, and then spreads from the book that show how all of the sources that feed into it are curated or conducted in the space of the book itself, and then have this sort of channel into after products. And so each publication, as a sort of middle between a before and an after, acts as a mediating device to condense and process these sources and influences through the matter of the book in order to produce its particular effects. So I'll just go through. So it starts 1910, right? You can see the case studies in the middle, and then moves forward towards the 50s. You can see the complete work is sort of strung through the middle of this sort of underlay, and then finally terminates with SNL. And so just to give you a sort of flavor of what the thing looks like in more detail, the 10 case studies are color-coded to make the sequences of before, during, after for each one legible. So each book has an identifying color that's applied to the images that correspond to it before and after the timeline. Layouts from the case study books, as this was exhibited on the wall originally, were presented in their original colors without any sort of manipulation, and the cover of each book was reproduced in the same scale as the book itself. Okay, and so if you will allow me, what I want to do here is go into one book as a sort of quick case study, just so that you can see all the things that feed into it, how it's conducted, sort of what it materializes into in the space of the book itself, and then the concept and structure. So I'm going to look at learning from Las Vegas. And I look at learning from Las Vegas here partly because the history of that book has been revived fairly heavily in the last few years. As you may know, there are at least 4 recent books that are entirely devoted to the origins of learning from Las Vegas, the process of its design, debates over the content between the first and the second edition. It was recently the subject, for example, of a conference at Yale, some of you may have seen. And so what follows is in part indebted to that work, but I've also chosen it here as a particularly rich example of the book as a certain kind of curatorial space, and of a very particularly charged battle over control over that space. And so my take on the book and the influences that went into it and how they were brought together ends up being a little different from the recent work that's been done. And so this is going to be like a quick tour of all of the, what I would claim are sources that go into it. One of them, quite heavily, is the influence of the Smithsons on Denise Scott-Brown, who studied at the AA in London before moving to the US and meeting Venturi. She credits the influence of the Smithsons when she was at the AA for furthering her, what she describes as a sort of anthropological interest in looking at urban spaces, looking at contexts, and trying to see them for what they are. And so this is some of the photography that was conducted by members of the independent group, such as Michael Henderson's photographs, that were part of the Smithsons' work. So she credits the Smithsons with tuning her to look at less at what the city was supposed to be and better for what it was, and then try to theorize based on that. One thing I think they also take from the Smithsons is an interest in the car. The Smithsons were extremely interested in the Citroen. The Citroen appears quite very frequently in photographs of the Smithsons project. So the Citroen is a kind of leitmotif that shows up in their work, and it reappears in the work of Venturi and Scott-Brown. Later, the Smithsons even went so far as to produce a book called AS and DS, Allison Smithson and the Citroen DS, that has the shape of the Citroen car. And so you can see this interest in the road as seen from space and the speed of the car, right? And you can see how some of these interests are then, how they appear in Las Vegas in a certain sort of sensitivity to the car and things of the scale of the car. That's a significant component of the work. Another source for this anthropological approach is Herbert Gans, the sociologist, also a major influence on Denise Scott-Brown, and she credits two books in particular, The Urban Villagers, which was a study of the West End in Boston from 1962, and in particular, The Levittowners from 1967, which is a year before the Learning from Las Vegas Studio was conducted at Yale, which is a study, sociological study of inhabitants of Levittown, suburban community as a new form of suburban community. So the studio that followed the Learning from Las Vegas studio that led to the book was called Learning from Levittown, which I picked up quite explicitly on Herbert Gans. And it's important to note, I think, that this studio, the Levittown studio, actually came before the publication of Learning from Las Vegas. And so there's some bits of this that appear in Learning from Las Vegas. So it was conducted after the studio, the Learning from Las Vegas studio, but before the publication of the book. In terms of mapping and images, how images were produced from the book, there are a series of relevant sources. One of them is Kevin Lynch and the Image of the City. And the mapping language that was developed there, this is 1960. Kevin Lynch was published by MIT Press, which was seen as a major actor in the story later. So this mapping language, also the mapping language of this is the Urban Atlas by Richard Saul Worman, who's now the guy who organizes the TED conferences. He's trained as an architect. He studied under Louis Kahn and did a monograph on Kahn. But he published this book. It's called Urban Atlas, 50 American Cities, and they're compared and drawn through these mapping techniques at a consistent scale, and their conclusions are sort of drawn from the data. Denise Scott-Brown wrote a review of this book that was published before they conducted the Learning from Las Vegas studio. She also wrote a review of urban structure in the monograph produced by the Smithsons. And so the books that they were reviewing gave you a sort of clue in terms of their influences. And so you could see in Learning from Las Vegas how this mapping language, which was quite consequential for them, in these new sorts of maps that they produce of activity patterns on the Las Vegas Strip. Or this is one of my favorite maps. This is at the top is a map of the Las Vegas Strip showing every written word seen from the road, scaled according to their visual account. And so this interest in producing different forms of mapping that can shed new light on this sort of urban condition. Another set of sources is from Venturi's own work prior to their partnership and prior to Learning from Las Vegas. And so it begins for Venturi with his Master of the Fine Arts thesis at Princeton from 1950. This is credited famously with introducing the word context into architectural vocabulary. He thinks of Gestalt psychology. He claims it's the first introduction of context into architectural vocabulary. And what's interesting here is the graphic methods that he employs, where he makes a sort of mapping of images that are taken from very different historical contexts, very different time periods, and he comes up with a system of relating to one another, all sort of held within the same space. Then when he goes on to produce the work that would become Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, he picks up on this method and he starts running with it. So this is Perspecta 1910, a year before Complexity and Contradiction comes out, where an excerpt of the material from that book is produced, and you can see that the graphic method is here being developed. And so images of buildings that are from radically different historical periods in a sort of like is matched with like visually kind of method. And then it's picked up on very heavily in Complexity and Contradiction. So it's a way of relating images to each other that may correspond to utterly different intentions purely through their formal similarities, and that are held together almost as a sort of collage or a kind of scrapbook. And so you can see some of that sensibility find its way into Learning from Las Vegas, where quite different sorts of images are all sort of put together. This like with like methodology is a major sort of visual influence on the book. Another influence is Ed Ruscha, as you guys all know, I'm sure. And his work, he does a series of these books, one which is studying for parking lots, and so he's interested in the parking lot, treating the parking lot as a certain sort of space, figures very heavily in their thinking. And then, of course, much more conspicuously, every building with a sunset strip, and this method of photographing in a linear way all of the buildings on the street, that they then pick up on explicitly and call an Ed Ruscha elevation of the strip. This is from the first edition. It doesn't quite make it through to the second edition. A huge influence for both of them that you can see tracking through Complexity and Contradiction and then through Learning from Las Vegas is Peter Blake's Gods on Junkyard from 1964, which is a sort of screed about what he called the planned destruction of the American landscape. And the book is a mostly sort of anecdotal and journalistic account of what he sees as these influences that are destroying sort of the beauty, the idyllic beauty of American townscapes and cityscapes and roadscapes. And you can see some of the bad stuff in those images. And so here we more of the bad stuff. And so the book is structured largely as a set of comparisons. There's always a sort of good image and a bad image. And so you can see here the good image is Jefferson's campus at UVA, and the bad image is Canal Street from New Orleans. Never mind the absurdity of comparing a campus with City Street as sort of equal models of cityscape. And so this method of comparison, here you can see another one, sort of the good on the top, the good roadscape, and on the bottom, the bad or sort of horrifying roadscape. And this method of comparison, Venturi and Scott-Brown pick it up quite directly, and they have a certain series of attacks that they launch progressively through their books on Peter Blake, on Gods on Junkyard. And so they simply pick up on his images and repeat them. So these are the same images from Gods on Junkyard, but repeated, but where they reverse the terms. And so what Blake sees as bad, they suddenly see as good. And so this is famously where Venturi makes the Main Street is almost all right analogy or claim in Complexity and Contradiction. So you can see this is the second edition, and so they even sort of weight the images accordingly, but the bad image now becomes the largest one. It's the one that they're the most interested in. Or similarly, they pick up on the bad roadscape image, and it becomes sort of key images that later. So this is before Learning from Las Vegas, and they're already staging a series of arguments that are directly at Peter Blake. And then, for example, most famously, the Long Island duckling comes from Gods on Junkyard. And so here you see it paired with images of people feeding ducks in a park, like to highlight the absurdity of the claim somehow. And then in Learning from Las Vegas, again, they use two images of Peter Blake's, and they don't just call them the Long Island duckling and the roadscape. They call them, you can see the captions, it says Long Island duckling from Gods on Junkyard, road scene from Gods on Junkyard. And so they're quite, their attacks are very, very direct. And this becomes the basis for the duck and decorated shape distinction, right? And so they just use it directly as material that gets revived with a completely different meaning in their own book. Another influence or immediate predecessor, I've already talked about the city as manifesto a little bit. I would claim is Los Angeles, the Architecture of Four Ecologies, which actually, it's very interesting to think about why Learning from Las Vegas has been a huge success in the years since, and Los Angeles Architecture of Four Ecologies much less so, even though they share a lot of quite heavy similarities. First of all, in the decision to look at a particular urban condition, in Banham's case, LA, in Venturi and Scott-Brown's case, Las Vegas, as two sort of what were seen as abject or uninteresting urban conditions, but which they chose to value as having something to say to architects in the present. Second, in their attention to the roadscape and the experiences they would see from the car. Third, in their mutual interest in Ed Ruscha. So the Architecture of Four Ecologies, it's very interesting that Banham actually uses the Ed Ruscha images, but he credits them in the sort of credits at the very end of the book, but he does it in a very deadpan, right? We think of Venturi and Scott-Brown as doing it deadpan. Banham also has, in some ways, an even more deadpan approach, where he simply uses these very potent Ed Ruscha images from the 34 Parking Lots book, but you wouldn't know it if you read the book unless you went to the credits at the end, so this is one of them. Significantly, the Architecture of Four Ecologies also has a very consistent type of mapping throughout. These were produced by Reyner Banham's wife, Mary Banham, and this is my favorite of all of them. This is a map of Los Angeles beaches, which is basically just a line with certain kinds of annotations made along the way. And so there's this very dry sort of mapping, which is another thing that is, another way in which it's the predecessor of Learning from Las Vegas. And here you can see, I'm sure you guys have all seen Reyner Banham Loves Los Angeles, the video. If you haven't seen it, you can get it on YouTube. This is a still from that. So the explicit interest in order to be able to read the city, you have to kind of see it on its own terms. And in Banham's case, that means getting into the car, in his case, teaching himself how to drive at a relatively advanced age. So that, I mean, his argument is that you can't, that the only way to properly see and read Los Angeles is from the car, right? So there you can see how directly this translates, or it finds echoes in Learning from Las Vegas, where a lot of the visual material is done through this camera that was set up in a car that they would drive down the strip and then take photographs. And you can see that reappear in the graphic language of the book. So this is Venturi and Scott-Brown kind of rolling down the strip. Okay, so that's a kind of quick tour of all the sort of things that feed into the Learning from Las Vegas studio at Yale in 1968. This is the studio people. So they went to Las Vegas, they took all of these photos, they did the groundwork. This was also really the precedent for what we know now as the current model of the urban research studio, where you do a studio trip, you do field work, you come back, you produce various kinds of mapping and diagrams. Denise Scott-Brown wrote heavily on this model as something that they were introducing into architectural pedagogy, and that they believed in very heavily. And so we forget now what the origins of it was, but the Learning from Las Vegas studio was really the first time, as far as I know, that had been conducted. But that wasn't the full set of influences. And so the influences were not entirely up to Venturi and Scott-Brown. Another major influence on the production of the first edition of the book was the publisher, MIT Press, and specifically the graphic designer, the house graphic designer for MIT Press, Muriel Cooper. And so she had her own set of influences. She was trained in modernist, quite Swiss graphic design, and she was producing at the time usually a lot of very large format books for MIT Press that were done, conceived of as a sort of large graphic space in which different kinds would sit and play with each other in a certain way. And so this is one of the books that she did before Learning from Las Vegas on the Bauhaus in 1964, and then another large format book that was a direct predecessor, The View from the Road, is Kevin Lynch, we've seen already with the image of the city. And The View from the Road is explicitly about perception of cityscapes as seen from the car, the speed of the car. And so she's already very interested graphically in a certain sort of cinematic sequence of images taken from the car and the kind of perception that you get as a result. Right? So you can see that there are already certain graphic projects that are conditioned the production. And so what you get is the first edition, it's published in 1972, as a large format of 11 by 18. And this was how Muriel Cooper, this was her method for conducting the relationships between images and text, certain kinds of cinematic sequences, and this was how she conducted the rhythm and pacing of the book. This is very much a graphic designer's sort of method. It would later become more frequent for architects, Kohlhaas among others, to do this sort of thing in staging out their own books, but at the time there was a very big split between a graphic designer's sensibility and a sort of architect sensibility and how they would work through these methods. And so this was the grid that Muriel Cooper came up with to regulate how these things would be placed within the book. And so these 5 columns that basically, so it was seen as a kind of large white space in which various things would float and take on certain relations to one another. And you can see how this plays out in the book. And so you get very sort of, you get cinematic sequences, images, you get things that are more sort of graphic or stylized sequences of related sorts of content, and you get a very particular relation between text and images that we'll see later. So these are footnotes that are within this kind of quite heavily spaced text and then text alongside it. So it uses the full range of effects that you can produce out of this sort of book, and so it's very much a visual language that speaks to graphic designers, but also speaks to architects. This is a kind of, you could call it a sort of architect's visual language of these maps. It's a folio volume, so these are printed quite large. And so it was an attempt to reproduce within the space of the book something of the experience of the Las Vegas Strip itself in in its kind of kinematic effects and in the perception that you would get from the car. So this is, you can see, this is Muriel Cooper staging again a graphic sequence that she's already tested in the book that she's designed for Kevin Lynch, but which also meshes with all of these influences we've seen feeding into Venturi and Scott-Brown's own work. This is the way the text relationships are sort of conducted. And you can see, this is the famous, from La Tourette to Neiman Marcus, sort of devastating comparison that Venturi and Scott-Brown conduct. And so you can see that the footnotes are used to sort of conduct a particular relation between a graphic sequence of images and the text that makes the argument alongside. And so this was very contested. Venturi and Scott-Brown hated this book. They had a whole series of battles with Muriel Cooper over how the book would be produced. And so if you've read the introduction to the edition that you guys all have, I'm sure, the second edition of Learning from Las Vegas, unless any of you have paid like $3,000 for the first edition, in which case I congratulate you. And so in the introduction to the second edition, Venturi and Scott-Brown describe the production of the second edition in this very dry and sort of innocent way by saying, after the first edition came out, we were people told us that it wasn't really legible and that the text wasn't legible, and we wanted it to just be kind of smaller and cheaper and a little bit easier to produce. That's totally false. The real story is that Venturi and Scott-Brown hated the first edition when it was being produced, and they hated Muriel Cooper's graphic method so much that they threatened to pull the publication of the book. And so they threatened to refuse publication of the book. And the only way to allow the first edition to be published was for the head of MIT Press to guarantee them the second edition that they would have complete editorial and graphic control over it. So the second edition is essentially theirs graphically, whereas the first edition is essentially Muriel Cooper's and MIT Press's, right? So that's how it played out. So it was a pretty fierce fight. It's not as innocent as they make it out to be. And so you can see, this is Venturi and Scott-Brown's notes that they make on a mock-up of the first edition. And so they're objecting to what they called the heroic late modernist graphic design of the book. And so their claim was, first of all, that they were opposed to heroism and late modernism in architecture, and that was explicitly their argument in the book. And so their claim was that the book itself shouldn't be based on a graphic design that would cater to those things. But they critiqued in architecture, they also sought to critique in graphic design. And their other argument was that they wanted the argument of the book to be, in a way, uncluttered. They said, you don't have to reproduce the experience of the Las Vegas Strip itself. The text itself is provocative enough in its arguments that you should just let the text sort of be as it is. Reproducing an experience of the Strip would sort of cloud the argument and would condition the argument in a way that they didn't want. So you can see, right, the placement of the title is the title page. And so they propose that it be moved to the middle, and they say, can this page be revised because its composition is like a duck? And so the book for them was a duck, and they wanted to decorate a shed. They wanted ugly and ordinary in the book, in the same way that they were advocating for in architectural terms. And so this is another comment they make. If these could stretch to the edge of the page, the details would be visible. And then Muriel Cooper, you can see, has said no. That she doesn't want to do that. So they just had really a war with each other. The funny thing is that this process, even though it's not really talked about, it seems like in the recent work that's been done on these books, the process of them contesting Muriel Cooper's graphic design actually runs against a lot of their own original intentions for the book itself. So these are mock-ups that were produced by the students in the Las Vegas studio right after the studio was over. So these were the first mock-ups that they sent to MIT Press as ideas for how the book would be produced. And you can see there are quite obvious similarities in the version that Muriel Cooper proposed, which they then reacted against very heavily. The book is seen as being a folio edition. It's seen as being a large white space in which smaller images will float. It's seen as having 3 columns of text. It's seen as having a particular sort of relationship between footnotes and the text itself. And so this is, again, these are the mock-ups that students under Venturi and Scott-Brown produced as guides for what was supposed to be the imagined publication. And so you get this contrast between the first edition and the second edition. The second edition is on the right. That's the one that you guys all own. And so you get, once they have control over it, you get this. You get ugly and ordinary. You get a very, very different, it's now a serif font, it's not a sans serif font. It's something that tries to look quite explicitly much more like a textbook And part of the project, I think, is an attempt to have a book that could sit on the bookshelf and speak to other audiences other than architects. And so for them, that means gutting a lot of the sort of architect's visual language out of it and making it read as a kind of dry, ugly, or ordinary textbook. And so text is text. It's never in the same space as images. Images sit in on their own double spreads. The two never mix. And so just to remind you, this sort of comparison between text and images in the first edition then turns into this. It just becomes a much drier comparison in the second edition. And there's also a very strange attempt to get images deliberately to not be lined up to each other. I mean, it's almost kind of anti-graphic design. There are many points in the text where the images could have been resized or fit, so it could sit within some sort of grid, and they explicitly don't have any interest in doing it. And even some of the more provocative or consequential parts of their graphic production in the beginning, like the Herbert J elevation of the strip, they somehow edit down or gut in the second edition, and so it becomes just a kind of, almost visual footnotes dropped along the bottom of the page, right? This kind of complex relation of text to text that turns into a much more dry. So this is the studio description that then just gets laid out in its own space. Okay, so deep breath for now. So that's a sort of, that's one of the case studies, right? And so now you can see, these are basically all the things that we've toured, complexity and contradiction, and how they get curated in this sort of space, and then how they produce the second edition as a revision of the first edition. So this sort of spectrum where you see influences kind of come in, get mediated in the work, and then sort of shoot off byproducts. That's basically the way these case studies have been conducted. Okay, so wrapping up. Are we doing okay? The project ultimately led to a series of questions about how these books were received, how they were received within the field, and what their operativity really was for the people who received them, which can be often very different from their agendas and their intended performance. And so there ended up being a certain relation between production and reception. And so in addition to the timeline, the set of case studies, which studies these books as an operative practice and their strategic role for the practitioners who made them, the second half of publishing practices was a survey that we did last year of about 150 practitioners, educators, and students, basically gauge the impact of these publications or of other publications on people that were trained in the field from the time of the publication of these books all the way up through the present. And so this is a graph of the results of the survey. So they were each asked to name 5 books that had been formative or important to them as architects trained in the field. And this is a timeline of all of the books that were listed, all of the unique books that were listed. And so the stacks indicate the number of times that each book was listed. And so you can probably guess what these are going to be already, but I'll talk some later. So that's sort of the first half of the timeline. The second half of the timeline, there were a lot of students involved in the survey, so the books sort of pick up more heavily towards the present. This is 1995, I dare you guess what that book is. And so one of the sort of interesting results of the survey was a few books that were extreme hits and were super popular, and then a real flatness to the rest of it, where nothing else really achieved any sort of critical mass, but then you had these kind of mega successful books. This we thought was sort of interesting. This is just that in more detail. And so we thought of this graphically as being like a city of books. And so at a certain point, we wanted to kind of reverse it and make the books almost architectural, somehow through the graphics. And so these are the most popular books. So you saw the kind of spikes in the thing. And so on the one hand, the 5 books that were listed most frequently by participants in the survey, and we had people that had gone to school from the mid-60s all the way up to the present. The 5 books that were the most frequently listed were SMLXL, Delirious New York, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Learning from Las Vegas, and Towards an Architecture. In other words, 5 out of the 10 case studies that we had chosen. And so, the most obvious result is that they confirmed that these books had in fact been influential in just the way that they were intended. On the other, the listing of these books was totally consistent across different ages, different places where people were writing from, different periods of education, and different current practices, whether people were practicing as architects or not. from those trained in the 60s all the way through the present. And so I was a little bit surprised that there were no peaks of influence for these books in the immediate aftermath of their publication. And so there was no detectable trend where the book was published, it had a spike of influence, and then it had a kind of long tail. Books that were popular and influential were popular and influential consistently all the way throughout. And we were also, you can see how flat it gets very quickly. So this is like 57 people listed as Excel, 45 listed for the University of New York, and then very quickly, once you get through the top 5, it ends up at about 10 people out of 150 listed a pattern language, and then it gets sort of incredibly flat. And so the number of books in the 20th century that achieved that sort of critical mass is actually quite limited. And in a way obvious in the sense that the case studies have already picked, precisely the 5, I would say. And so this kind of consistent appearance in the lists of even the most recent students reveals the continuing influence of these publications up to the present, despite radical changes in the production and dissemination of both architecture and books, and the emergence of other competing forms of media in the digital era. This was a kind of surprising result. We also asked a series of questions of participants about how they saw the book, what the role of the book was, how they used them, where they got them, whether they thought books still mattered. And so this is just to zoom in. Right? What do you primarily read architecture books for or as? Are books a valid form of architectural production? And it was interesting to me. I was actually surprised by how the majority of people said that books are just as valid a form of production as buildings, but I wasn't necessarily expecting that result. So maybe in that sense, my whole project was really obvious, and I shouldn't have bothered doing it. Where do you get your architectural information from these days? Not surprisingly, a lot of stuff, etc. And then what will happen to architectural books in the future? These are just a few of the questions. This looks like a heartening answer. Other media will replace certain types of book content. This one's going to go sort of slowly. And then we asked them more specific questions about the 5 books that they chose. And so these are questions about the 2 top hits. The outer ring in each of these is answers about SML-XL, and the inner ring is answers about the University of New York. When did they first find them? How did they first find them? Have they bothered even looking at these books? And do they think these books are still valuable? And so there were certain consistencies that I thought were kind of interesting. And so one of the questions that I would pose out of this is about SML-XL. As the last member of this chronology, SML-XL was 1995, it was 15 years ago. And so the survey raised the particular question of whether SML-XL may stand as the final definitive example of what you could talk about as a canonical book, in the sense that we described it already. And so it appeared quite dramatically at a moment of confluence between new modes of production, the rising cultural status of the architect, the first impacts of globalization on architectural and publishing practices, and the increasing influence of theory, but before the consolidation of history theory and one thing in practice as increasingly separate disciplines that cater to different audiences, significantly before the proliferation of both Ph.D. programs and architectural publishing. And it also predated, to some extent, the rise of digital media that would alter the traditional role of the book after the 1990s. And so, in that sense, there's a question about whether the success of SML-XL as the last sort of mega book may simply be impossible to replicate, in part the product of a historically unrepeatable set of circumstances. And so no publication emerged from the survey as a candidate for the next influential canonical book. And it remains to be seen whether there will be one again, or whether the idea of the canonical or the influential and the role of publishing among other practices may have undergone a definitive change in the